the war continues in Iran. The country has been pounded from the skies by American and Israeli planes for 21 days now. Every major city has been hit. The country and its people are in disarray. The death toll has exceeded 1,000 and continues to rise. And yet, so far, the regime remains. On March 8th, it was announced that Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the recently killed supreme leader, would be taking his father's place. As he was elected, the remaining leadership around him continues to be targeted. On March 17th, Iranian security chief Ali Larijani and Gholam Reza Soleimani, head of the Basij paramilitary force, were killed in Israeli airstrikes. And overnight strikes reportedly killed Iran's intelligence minister, Esmail Khatib. As missiles and bombs rained down on Iran, attacks in the vital shipping lane of the Strait of Hormuz have sent the price of oil skyrocketing. This week, what's the state of the US and Israeli air campaign in Iran? Are we any clearer on the objectives of the war? And how has the Gulf been impacted by the daily attacks? My name is Hugo Goodridge, and you're listening to The New Arab Voice. On our last episode, we asked the question, why did the US and Israel launch this attack when they did, and what do they want? Our conclusion was the same as most other people. It's a bit unclear. On February 28th, announcing the war from Mar-a-Lago, US President Donald Trump gave a host of reasons.
The United States military is undertaking a massive and ongoing operation to prevent this very wicked, radical dictatorship from threatening America and our core national security interests. We are going to destroy their missiles and raise their missile industry to the ground. It will be totally, again, obliterated. We're going to annihilate their Navy. We're going to ensure that the region's terrorist proxies can no longer destabilize the region or the world. And we will ensure that Iran does not obtain a nuclear weapon.
To recap, that's protecting US interests, destroying missile production and their navy, preventing support for proxies, and stopping Iran getting a nuclear weapon. In the same speech, he called on the Iranian people to rise up and overthrow the regime. That's all fine, although it could be argued that at least some of those things could have been achieved at the US-Iran talks that were ongoing before the start of the war. He repeated these objectives in a speech on March 2nd. Although, as the war has progressed, the notion of regime change has been heard less, and as the stubbornness of the regime to survive has become more apparent, it appears to be less of a key objective of the Trump administration. As the war went through its opening days, the messaging around the timing for the war started to shift. On March 2nd, Trump's Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, made a surprising statement.
We knew that there was going to be an Israeli action. We knew that that would precipitate an attack against American forces. And we knew that if we didn't preemptively go after them before they launched those attacks, we would suffer higher casualties and perhaps even higher those killed. And then we would all be here answering questions about why we knew that and didn't act.
And then, on March 3rd, President Trump appeared to refute Rubio's comments and put himself at the center.
We were having negotiations with these lunatics, and it was my opinion that they were going to attack first. They were going to attack. If we didn't do it, they were going to attack first. I felt strongly about that. And we have great negotiators, great people that do this very successfully and have done it all their lives very successful. And based on the way the negotiation was going, I think they were going to attack first. And I didn't want that to happen. So if anything, I might have forced Israel's hand.
According to Trump, his unflappable powers of political premonition, or intelligence given to him, told him that Iran was going to attack. But according to Rubio, the US decided to attack, yes, because Iran was going to attack, but according to him, in response to a first Israeli attack. These are similar, but different. In the first, the US preemptively struck because Iran was going to attack. In the second, the US preemptively struck because Israel was going to attack, which would have then provoked an Iranian attack. This has led some to accuse the Trump administration of being beholden to the decision-making of Israeli Prime Minister and fanatic Iran hater Benjamin Netanyahu. A day later, amid an outcry, much coming from inside the MAGA ranks, Marco Rubio walked back his comments. A cynic might say that Marco Rubio accidentally told the truth on March 2nd. Perhaps the official record of why the decision was taken when it was taken will never be released. And considering where we are now, maybe it doesn't matter anymore. The US and Israel are at war with Iran. For over 2 weeks now, they've been dropping a vast number of bombs on Iran. But what are they targeting?
The US and Israeli campaign against Iran includes several phases.
This is Annika Ganzavad, Middle East Portfolio Manager at the Critical Threats Project.
At the start of this campaign, the US and Israel initially targeted Iranian missile launchers, suppressed Iran's air defenses, decapitated Iran's command and control in order to establish air superiority and limit Iran's ability to retaliate.
The US and Israel have been highly effective in this. At the time of recording, only one plane has been shot down by Iran. A success for Iran, but a very small win compared to the thousands of bombs that have already been dropped.
The US and Israel have used a variety of systems to attack Iran, including fighter jets, missiles, drones, bombers. And as the US and Israel have achieved air superiority, they have been able to drop from aircraft directly on top of their targets, as opposed to having to launch them from a distance. And they've been able to do this because Iranian air defenses don't pose a significant threat to US and Israeli aircraft. So the US and Israel have reportedly destroyed up to 80% of Iran's air defenses.
With the almost complete neutering of Iranian air defenses, the combined forces of the US and Israel have been able to move focus to other areas,
which has then enabled them to pivot to attacking other targets that don't pose as immediate a threat. So, for example, missile, drone, air defense production sites. These strikes aim to degrade Iran's ability to rebuild its military capabilities in the medium to long term, in contrast with the initial strikes that aim to degrade Iran's military capabilities that posed an immediate threat to the US and Israel.
In his Reasons for War, President Trump highlighted the need to prevent Iran from creating nuclear weapons. However, Iran's nuclear sites, at least for the time being, have not been the focus of US and Israeli operations.
It hasn't been the primary target. At least from what we can tell in the open source, there's two main nuclear facilities that have been targeted during the current war. One is the more well-known Natanz nuclear facility, which both the United States and Israel struck in the June war last year. And the second is a lesser-known site called Taliqan 2. This site is near Tehran, and Iran previously used this site to test explosives that are needed to detonate a nuclear device before it suspended its nuclear weapons program in 2003.
Some sites, such as the Pickaxe Mountain facility, appear to have been ignored.
There was a report of a vehicle near Pickaxe Mountain being struck, but the actual site, as far as we know, hasn't been struck. And additional nuclear sites, such as the Esfahan nuclear technology site and Fordo that were struck in June, haven't been struck during this current conflict. And that likely reflects that, those sites are still damaged from the June war, that they haven't been as high of a priority to strike during the current conflict.
Much of the focus in recent days has been on Iran's ability to cause disruption at sea. And since the beginning of the conflict, Iran's navy has been a target for US and Israeli bombers.
The United States has been systematically targeting Iranian naval infrastructure, naval assets along the coast. The US has destroyed I think it's more than 60 Iranian ships, including 16 mine-laying vessels. And we have not seen, any attacks in the Strait of Hormuz in the recent days. The last confirmed attack was on March 11th, so 5 days ago. It is a bit unclear whether this is just because there's less vessels transiting through the strait, or whether the military operations are succeeding in suppressing Iran's capabilities to conduct attacks in the strait. But regardless, the United States and Israel are continuing to try to degrade Iran's naval capabilities in order to ensure that there can be free passage through the strait again.
Iran has been hit relentlessly by the US and Israel since the start of the war. According to the US and Israel, jointly, they struck 4,000 targets in the first 100 hours of the war. For context, the US-led coalition's bombing campaign against ISIS struck around 3,000 targets in the first 6 months of that war. The first 100 hours in Iran saw approximately double what the Israelis dropped on Gaza during the first 100 hours of that genocide. As of Friday, March 20th, 1,444 people have been killed in Iran, with over 18,000 injured. Iran is a relatively powerful military force, but compared to the likes of the US and the US-funded and armed Israel, it pales in comparison. But that does not mean they have been sitting idly by. They have been on the offensive. From the start of the war, Iran has been launching ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones at targets all across the region. Every single country in the Gulf has been targeted, as well as Israel, Iraq, Jordan, Turkey, and Cyprus. Interception rates have been high, but a number of projectiles have reached their targets. Buildings have been struck, soldiers killed and injured. Sadly, so too have civilians been lost. Given that they host a number of US military bases, it's unsurprising that Gulf nations have fallen into the crosshairs of Iranian missiles. But it hasn't just been them, also civilian targets. Was the targeting of civilians anticipated by Gulf nations?
To be honest, for quite some time, the last couple of decades, the Gulf states and everyone involved, including myself, I've worked out in the Gulf and I've worked with Gulf militaries for many, many years. We've been planning for this kind of worst case scenario of a war with Iran and how that would look like, how would it unfold.
This is Dr. Andreas Krieg, Associate Professor at King's College London at the School of Security Studies.
What sort of targets would Iran choose? How would they try to exercise pressure on the world economy as well as on the Gulf economy, and trying to hit the centers of gravity of these Gulf states? So it was to be expected for Iran to respond in that way. I think the expectation was probably that Iran would gradually escalate rather than escalate all at once. I mean, they went nuclear quite early on. And also that there would be more warnings and it would be more sort of discriminate in the way that Iran is targeting. But it then became quite clear very quickly that they were willing to go all in, choose a very broad set of targets, of which many were civilian, and had absolutely no connection to the US-Israeli war against Iran. And obviously the Gulf states remained neutral throughout. They haven't provided any operational support.
Gulf nations would have anticipated attacks and could also believe that Iran would target civilians. The deadly crackdown on protests in December and January was a clear indication that Iran has few, if any, red lines. But the decision to target civilian areas and buildings so early on in the war was shocking, and not to mention a war crime.
So a lot of the targets that Iran has chosen, particularly in the energy sector and also critical national infrastructure like ports and airports, but also hotels, were probably sort of expected to be the acts of last resort, and obviously are war crimes, and certainly crossed all kinds of red lines that the Gulf states didn't expect to be hit in the first phase of this operation.
The types of target in Iran's retaliation has been broad. But what is Iran hoping to achieve with these attacks? Has their retaliation been, quote-unquote, effective, in Tehran's opinion? Annika Ganzerveld again.
I think it's important here when we, talk about kind of the effectiveness of Iran's retaliatory attacks to remember that the objective of these attacks for Iran is to impose a high enough cost on the US and Israel to dissuade them from continuing the war against Iran. And Iran's retaliatory attacks this far have failed to do so, as the US and Israel continue to be able to accomplish their objectives against Iran. Some Iranian munitions have certainly gone through US and Israeli air defenses. For example, Iranian ballistic missiles with cluster munition warheads have caused damage and casualties in Israel. And an Iranian drone attack killed 6 US service members in Kuwait in the beginning of the war. And these attacks are certainly notable and certainly significant. But the United States and Israel are continuing to accomplish their objectives in Iran despite the damage and casualties that Iran has inflicted thus far.
In the first couple of days of fighting, Iran unleashed an intense volley of missiles across the region. Since then, the number of missiles has steadily dropped.
The attacks have definitely drastically decreased since the start of this war, and that's largely due to the degradation of Iran's ability to launch ballistic missiles and drone attacks. The targeting of Iranian launchers, of Iran's ballistic missile and drone stockpiles, prevents them from being able to conduct these kinds of retaliatory attacks. So just to give a few examples, Iran launched over 300 drones at the United Arab Emirates on March 1st, so right after the war started. Yesterday, they only launched 6 drones at the UAE. Similarly, with Israel, Iran launched around 90 missiles at Israel on the first day of the war, but now they're only launching a small number of missiles at Israel each day.
Devastating attacks against the Gulf continue. On March 18th, for example, Iran struck the Ras Laffan liquid natural gas plant in Qatar, with the attack reportedly reducing the country's export capacity by 17%. That's equivalent to tens of billions of dollars a year. This was in response to an Israeli attack on South Pars, part of the world's largest natural gas field. Iran's attack was particularly impactful and has further added stresses on the global energy markets. On this occasion, Iran hit its target, but the majority of Iranian missiles entering the airspace of both Gulf countries and Israel have been intercepted. It's a tricky maneuver to pull off, effectively shooting one bullet out the sky with another bullet. But with modern missile systems, such as the US Patriot missile, it is possible. With the use of such high-tech equipment, Gulf nations have been able to achieve a high interception rate. The UAE has reported an overall interception rate of approximately 93% against ballistic missiles and drones. Qatar's overall interception rate stands at 89%. Qatar has performed well against ballistic missiles, but less so against drones, intercepting just 72%. But as mentioned, hitting a ballistic missile out the sky is a tricky business, and it's not uncommon to fire 2 or perhaps 3 interceptors at each missile, just to be sure. And as such, concerns have been raised about the stockpiles of these interceptors.
The size of the US interceptor stockpile remains unclear, but what is clear is that the US and Israel have designed this campaign in a way to destroy Iran's ballistic missile capabilities before Iran is able to deplete the United States and Israel's interceptor stockpiles. So the strikes on Iranian ballistic missile launchers and stockpiles prevent Iran from conducting attacks that would require interceptors to stop. And we've seen reports that around 2/3 of Iran's missiles that are capable of reaching Israel are no longer operational. Now, I will note it's unclear how much of Iran's short-range ballistic missiles, which are able to reach US bases and Gulf states, remains operational. But at least from the kind of medium and long-range missiles that are able to reach Israel, around 2/3 of those are reportedly not operational. And additionally, the US and Israel have destroyed more than 300 of Iran's ballistic missile launchers, which is around 60% of Iran's total launcher stockpile. And the destruction of these launchers reduces the risk that either the United States or Israel will run out of interceptors because they're limiting Iran's ability to launch missiles in the first place.
And Dr. Andreas Krieg.
So this US-Israeli war against Iran is a war of attrition that essentially neither side can actually fundamentally win. I mean, in terms of it's not going to be a zero-sum outcome where one side loses and the other side wins. I think it's a race against time. It's a war of endurance. And a lot of that main factor of that endurance is about projectiles and the ability for the Iranians to shoot projectiles, whether these are ballistic missiles or drones. And for the other side, the Americans and also the Gulf states being able to intercept these incoming projectiles. And, if you look at, despite the fact that Iran's capability has been severely degraded, so we've seen a clear collapse and a downward trend in terms of the number of projectiles being shot and fired at the Gulf. We've also seen that at the same time, the Iranians have been able to sustain some sort of pressure. So they kind of contained their use of ballistic missiles and have gone into more heavy use of drones, of which they have nearly infinite amounts. At the same time, almost every interception costs the same amount for the Gulf states, which is extremely expensive. So it's a war over efficiency and economics as well, because an interceptor missile costs somewhere between $3 and $4 million, and one of these drones costs somewhere between $10,000 to $20,000 to produce. And so we had a bit of a change. So in the early days, the Gulf states mostly relied on intercepting missiles, and then have moved to more of a forward defense posture where they're using their own air power platforms to intercept sort of incoming projectiles and using air-to-air missiles, which are slightly cheaper, but obviously that only works on those drones, and it's very difficult to actually target ballistic missiles as they're coming down.
There is no doubt that the stockpile of interceptors is going down. There's only a finite number, and they are complicated and expensive to make. But so too is Iran's stockpile of missiles and the launchers needed to fire those missiles. Drones are another issue, far cheaper to produce and far easier to deploy, but also slower moving, easier to shoot down, and there are more options in terms of what munitions are available to do that job. In recent days, much attention has been given to the Strait of Hormuz. You've likely heard much about the Strait of Hormuz. It's a narrow shipping channel through which around 20% of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas passes through, at least during peacetime. On the northern side of the strait is Iran, while to the south lies Oman and the UAE. At its narrowest point, the Strait of Hormuz is just 33 kilometers or 20 miles across.
One of the main things that they're doing is launching surface-to-surface missiles at commercial vessels. We have confirmed reports of multiple strikes on vessels in the Strait of Hormuz since the start of the war. Additionally, Iran has reportedly started laying a small number of mines in the strait. So I think the reports we have right now are fewer than 10 mines. And just to give a sense of scale, Iran has around 5,000 to 6,000 mines. So laying fewer than 10 mines suggests that this is more so meant to achieve a kind of psychological effect.
The Strait of Hormuz is a vital shipping channel for the likes of the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, and to a lesser degree, Saudi Arabia. But also Iran. Iran is an oil-producing country. Even with the sanctions, they still exported a considerable amount of oil, and it's a revenue stream that they are not wanting to lose. While exports through the Strait of Hormuz are down 95%, Iran has still managed to export well above 16 million barrels of oil since the beginning of March. It's worth saying that the Gulf is not a single entity. Some Gulf states are more heavily impacted by disruption in the strait than others.
So I think the UAE, for example, obviously Abu Dhabi is very well endowed financially, and they can compensate some of the losses because of the investments that they've made overseas. The same is true for Qatar. Then you have the Northern Emirates. Dubai in particular is a service-based economy. It's relying on ease of doing business, stability, security, attracting capital, attracting investments, and also attracting sort of people that can keep the country running, as keep Dubai running and going. There are some differences in terms of how well integrated the Gulf states are into the global economy. So Saudi, Qatar, UAE are very, very important in terms of the global economy, not just in terms of the energy flows and obviously being key hubs or key nodes in the global energy economy, but they're also important hubs when it comes to cargo, freight, shipping, and obviously aviation, and we've seen a lot of that impacting as well. And so these sort of disruptions will have an impact on the reputation of them being kind of global hubs. But the Strait of Hormuz is not a Gulf problem. The Strait of Hormuz is a part of the global commons, and any sort of disruption and interference with the Strait of Hormuz is essentially an attack on the global economy, and thereby affects all of us. And it's not an issue for Oman or UAE, which are closest to the Strait.
Recent headlines about attacks in the Strait of Hormuz have focused on oil and gas shipments and the prices rising at the petrol pumps. But this disruption will ripple out far beyond consumers' cars.
It's a problem for anyone trying to trade energy products and derivatives of energy products. So it's not just oil and gas, it's sulfur, it's aluminum, it's helium, and a lot of other derivatives which are essential for the world economy, especially for high tech. And then obviously energy is the one thing that underwrites every economy to this day. So if you're reliant on, we're all reliant to a degree on oil and gas, which means that whatever price increase we're witnessing there will have ripple effects across the world economy. And so in that respect, this is something that doesn't just worry the Gulf states in terms of their income. And again, Abu Dhabi and Qatar being probably the two players here who can sustain the pressure, despite the fact that they're incurring heavy costs and losses at the moment because of the inability to export. They're the ones who are financially most robust to actually bounce back. If you look at Saudi Arabia, they've found alternative ways to bypass the Strait of Hormuz through their pipelines and then unloading in the Red Sea. Oman obviously sits on the outside of the Strait of Hormuz. For them, they're probably one of the main benefactors because they become the key hub to sustain the Gulf and kind of create if you will, a strategic backup for the GCC. Kuwait sits at the very end of the Gulf, furthest away from the Strait. They're also heavily affected, particularly when it comes to food and food security, because most of the food produce that is imported to the Gulf is imported by ship through the Strait of Hormuz. So alternative supply chains had to be developed. And again, Oman playing a very important role in that. So there are slight differences. I think the one country that's most heavily affected by this is Bahrain, for a variety of different reasons. Number one is Bahrain relies almost entirely on aluminum and oil exports for their income. And already they're facing quite a massive sort of budgetary constraint this year. And now they're basically losing almost all of their income. And they've lost all of their income, and they're not financially as stable as, let's say Qatar or Saudi Arabia in that respect. So they will feel it the hardest compared to the other Gulf states.
This war was started by the US and Israel. They are its owners. As a result, they have been targeted. Israeli towns and cities have been hit. So too have US bases in the region. The Gulf didn't ask for this war. They've not engaged in offensive actions against Iran, and yet their infrastructure and civilians quickly became and remain targets in this war.
I think the Gulf is extremely frustrated with the United States at this point. If you think about how much investment has gone from the Gulf states into the United States under Trump, directly into the Trump administration and individuals affiliated with the Trump administration, we're talking trillions of dollars, literally. 3.6 trillion, I think, is what Saudi, Qatar, and the UAE pledged to invest in the United States in the coming years. All of that in an attempt to kind of sway Donald Trump. None of this seems to matter right now. We see very little in terms of support from the US. The US seems to have chosen an Israeli first approach over the Gulf states, and have basically kind of hedged or kind of taken the risk and accepted the risk or hazarded the consequences of this decision and also what it means for the Gulf states.
Prior to this war, the US would be described as the Gulf's strongest security guarantor.
There is a lot of thinking going on at the moment in the Gulf states over how they're going to pursue and how they're going to continue that relationship with the United States and whether the United States is actually a viable and reliable security partner. And at the moment, it doesn't look like they are. Obviously, at the same time, the Gulf doesn't really have any short-term alternatives. So they've been trying for years to create more strategic autonomy, divesting away from America where possible, having relationships with countries like Pakistan or India, or potentially even with China, and obviously European partners. But none of them were able to actually compensate for what the Americans are able to put on the table.
So far, the Gulf's military action has been purely defensive. Might they change? Respond more directly to Iran's attacks? Go on the offensive?
Against this backdrop, it's also hard to imagine for the Gulf states what they can potentially, add to what is essentially an Israeli war against Iran, to which the Americans were dragged into. And obviously, the number one thing that the Gulf states want to avoid is being dragged into a war that is not their war, is not a war of their choosing, and is also not a war that will see them as equal partners, because they will essentially become junior partners to Israel. At the same time, the predicament is obviously that they have to defend themselves. And what they've been doing so far is defending their homeland, intercepting incoming projectiles, pushing out forward defense as far as they can, trying to intercept as early as possible, obviously using their air forces to do this. But so far, that's the extent of it, because they're also saying to themselves, what is it that we can contribute? Ultimately, the US and Israel are struggling to achieve the objectives on the ground, and a bit more bombing and a few more platforms will not essentially make a difference in what, as I said earlier on, is a war of attrition between Iran and the US and Israel. In that war of attrition, you have to, as a Gulf state now, think whether your contribution will be in any way beneficial to your national security and will outweigh the costs that you will incur from becoming a participant in Israel's war, essentially.
When this war ends, and it will end, Iran, in some form, will still be there. Geography doesn't change. The Gulf has a choice: be neighbours with a country it actively attacked, or neighbours with a country that it defended itself from. The US has made numerous comments about what it wants. But what does the Gulf want?
First of all, they didn't want the war to begin with. The situation around them has changed. They're being forced into a war because they become, they're now on the receiving end of this war. I think they've become the collateral damage of an Israeli war. I think Israeli actions yesterday against the north or the south Pars field, the gas field in Iran, really was an attack indirectly on Qatar, because the Israelis knew the Iranians would respond, and they would respond attacking the Gulf. But now in this situation, de-escalation is essentially what the Gulf states want, and that's still the overwhelming, overarching objective. The question is, how can you achieve it, and how can you achieve it sustainably? And whether any sort of military contribution to this Israeli war will actually change or create a more likely off-ramp. It doesn't seem that's the case. I think Trump's approach of saying we're escalating to de-escalate is clearly backfiring. Deterrence doesn't work on the regime as it stands in Iran. And so what you end up with from the Gulf perspective is you kind of want to return to a status quo ex ante, which I don't think exists. I don't think we will just go back to the world of before the 28th of February. That's very unlikely.
This war has reiterated two important points. Firstly, that the Iranian regime is stronger than one man and cannot be so easily removed. How many times have we heard the phrase, "This is the weakest that the regime has been since 1979, only for the regime to survive." Without a commitment on the ground, the regime in Iran can survive this. And secondly, with little cost, without grand planning, Iran can send seismic shocks throughout the global economy.
And so we're in a spiral of escalation where I think the Iranians are slightly more dominant than the Americans are. And the Gulf states, what they don't want to be left alone with an emboldened Iranian regime, able to use their projectiles, able to use the power that they've now accumulated, as well as the confidence to use it, and continuously targeting oil and gas infrastructure, targeting shipping around the Strait of Hormuz and elsewhere in the Indian Ocean or in the Gulf. So, there again comes a problematic point where the Gulf states now have to ask themselves whether, finishing the job is something that is actually achievable. Ideally, removing the regime now would be great, but if that's not a feasible option, then what's the second best option? And the second best option is still some sort of negotiated settlement where at least maybe the Gulf states will have some sort of agreement with Iran, bilaterally or multilaterally, without the United States in the picture. But I can't see the Iranians agreeing to that as long as the Gulf states will host US forces on their soil. So it's a very, very difficult situation. And as I said, it's a war of endurance, which I think favors the Iranians over the Gulf and over the United States.
This episode of The New Arab Voice was written and produced by me, Hugo Goodridge. Our theme music was by Omar Al-Phil. The New Arab Voice will be back with a new episode shortly. Don't forget to subscribe to get notified when a new episode drops. You can find the links in the show notes. Until then, you can find all our previous episodes on all major podcast platforms. You can also check out our social media accounts on Instagram and X, both at TNA Podcasts, for additional content. And you can email us, podcast@newarab.com. That's podcast@newarab.com. You can subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode, and you can also rate and review, which helps us spread the word. Don't forget to follow The New Arab on Facebook, X and Instagram for all the latest news, analysis and opinion from the region.